In the glittering heart of Dubai, where gold reflects even off the night sky and secrets travel faster than gossip, there are stories that never reach the newspapers, stories whispered only among chauffeurs, hotel staff, and the rare witnesses who swear they saw something impossible. This is one of those stories, a tale born not in the boardrooms of power or the deserts of legacy, but in the unexpected moment when a man who had everything discovered the one thing he had never been able to buy: genuine connection. And it all began at a wedding where fate slipped in, disguised as a simple choice. Who would walk up to the man the rest of the world feared? For years, people spoke of Khalid al-Rashad as a billionaire carved from stone, cold, immaculate, and untouchable. Rumors painted him as a ghost at his own parties, a man who stood among crowds but never belonged to them. Some said he preferred silence. Others said life had taught him that trusting the wrong people could destroy empires. But none of them knew the truth made of flesh, exhaustion, and loneliness, until the night his solitude became impossible to ignore. Witnesses would later swear that destiny didn't just tap his shoulder, it crashed into him wearing an apron and carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. And yet, what unfolded wasn't a fairy tale or an act of rebellion. It was a collision between two worlds that should never have touched, one built on unimaginable wealth and one built on quiet survival. It was the kind of encounter that rewrites a person from the inside out, the kind that changes the temperature of a room, the rhythm of a heart, the future of a life. People at that wedding watched the sparks, but never understood the fire. But you will. Because this story, told as it truly happened, reveals how a single moment can dismantle a lifetime of walls, and how even the richest man in the room can be the loneliest until the right stranger decides to walk toward him. The moment it happened, the entire wedding hall seemed to breathe differently. A single chair, his chair, scraped sharply across the polished marble floor as the last guest seated near him stood up and hurried away to join a livelier table. The sound echoed like an accusation, slicing through the orchestra's soft music and pulling a few curious glances toward the man left sitting alone. Khalid al-Rashad didn't move, didn't flinch, but the isolation around him grew like a circle, drawn in chalk, clear, cold, and impossible to ignore. The bride's cousins whispered about him from behind flower arrangements, small conspiratorial smiles lighting their faces. The groomsmen laughed too loudly as they passed by, pretending they hadn't shifted their celebration to a different corner just to avoid sharing a table with him. Even the waiters, nervous, overworked, avoiding mistakes, were subtly rerouting themselves so they wouldn't be the one forced to approach the billionaire whose expression could freeze a river. And in that swelling silence, the truth became unmistakable. He wasn't just alone. He was ostracized, exiled at a wedding he helped pay for. Then, in the middle of that widening void, something unexpected happened, something that would later be recounted in hushed amazement by every staff member in the room. A single waitress, balancing a tray of empty flutes, stopped. She looked directly at Khalid, not with fear, not with calculation, but with a curiosity soft enough to feel like rebellion. While the rest of the hall moved away from him as if he carried a curse, she took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and began walking toward the man no one dared approach. And that simple step, quiet, defiant, almost invisible, would alter the course of both their lives forever. Khalid al-Rashad had been born into a dynasty where silence was inherited like property. From childhood, he learned that emotions were liabilities, that affection could be weaponized, and that trust was a currency more dangerous than oil. His father built empires while dismantling every bond around him, and Khalid grew up surrounded by marble floors, private tutors, and security teams, but never warmth. By adulthood, he had mastered every room he entered, but none of them ever truly held him. To the world, he was the man who could buy anything. To himself, he was the man who could never keep anything he cared about. Now nearing his mid-30s, he carried the weight of a corporation worth billions, but the cost was written in the quiet lines around his eyes. Nights blurred into board meetings, days vanished in negotiations, and every victory tasted faintly of exhaustion. His phone buzzed with demands, not invitations. Assistants scheduled his sleep as if rest were a luxury item, and despite the power he wielded, he moved like someone expecting betrayal at every turn. Not because he was paranoid, but because he had lived through it. Partners had turned on him, friends had sold him out, lovers had rehearsed affection just to sign contracts with his family name. Still, beneath the layers of composure, something stubborn and fragile remained, a quiet hunger for something real. Khalid admired small acts of honesty, the kind most people overlooked. He remembered strangers who held doors open without recognition, baristas who drew hearts on coffee cups without knowing who he was, workers who laughed freely, without expecting a reward. These slivers of humanity were his escape, his hidden comfort, the life he wished he could live without the weight of legacy pressing against his spine. And that night, as he sat alone at the wedding, he didn't realize that the world he longed for was finally walking straight toward him. Rafik Darzi entered the wedding hall the way a storm enters a quiet sea, loud, bright, and impossible to ignore. His laughter rose above the music, his cologne followed him like a signature, and every handshake he offered seemed to pull people instantly into his orbit. He was the type of man who was never alone, never unnoticed, never denied, a self-made magnate who climbed from the desert outskirts into global fame. He wore success like armor and charm, like a sword. And for reasons buried deep in childhood rivalry, he had always taken silent pleasure in outshining Khalid whenever their paths crossed. Where Khalid was a statue of restraint, Rafik was a spectacle of excess. He swept through the tables, greeting guests with theatrical warmth, kissing cheeks, making lavish promises, playing the generous king in a palace of borrowed adoration. People adored him because he made them feel important. People feared Khalid because he made them feel exposed. And Rafik nurtured that contrast with meticulous intention. Even tonight, at their mutual friend's wedding, he moved like a man performing in a spotlight, knowing his presence drew attention, especially attention away from the one person who refused to play his games. But beneath the smiles and golden confidence, Rafik carried a sharpness polished by years of competition. He noticed instantly that Khalid was alone, not by accident, but by atmosphere, and it pleased him. He leaned against the bar, swirling his drink with a smirk, studying the isolation surrounding his old rival, like it was an artwork he himself had commissioned. In their world, reputation was in currency, and to see a billionaire seated without company at a public event was the sweetest form of silent humiliation. Rafik didn't need to speak to wound. He only needed to be seen winning, especially when Khalid wasn't playing. The humiliation arrived, disguised as celebration. As the bride and groom moved to the center of the dance floor for their first dance, the MC called for all honored guests to gather around them. People rose from their tables, forming an elegant circle. Everyone except Khalid, who remained seated because no one had invited him to join their group. The space around him widened again, like a slow tide pulling back, leaving him exposed at the farthest edge of the room. Cameras swept across the crowd, capturing smiling faces, sparkling dresses, lifted glasses, and then lingered awkwardly on the solitary figure the videographer didn't know whether to include or avoid. Rafik seized the moment with the precision of a man who had waited years for it. He strode toward the dance floor, stopping just close enough for his voice to carry back to Khalid's table. "Some people prefer to watch from the outskirts," he said with a grin sharp enough to cut glass. He wasn't looking at Khalid when he said it, but everyone else was. Laughter rippled through the guests, small but cruel, the kind that tries to hide itself behind champagne flutes. Even the orchestra seemed to hesitate, as if the air had changed temperature. Khalid's jaw tightened by a fraction, a movement so subtle only those who hoped to see him break would catch it. And then came the final blow, delivered without mercy. A waiter carrying a tray of gold-rimmed glasses paused near Khalid's table, trying to decide whether to offer him a drink. Before the young man could step forward, Rafiq called out across the room, "Leave that one, he's fine alone." The guests laughed again, louder this time, the humiliation landing squarely in front of the man who had built skyscrapers but couldn't escape a moment engineered to make him small. For a heartbeat, he sat perfectly still, a monument of composure in the middle of a storm. But beneath that stillness, something old and bitter twisted inside him, something that would soon collide with fate in a way no one expected. The exact moment his hidden power surfaced was almost invisible to the room. Almost. As the laughter faded and guests drifted back into their conversations, one of the violinists near the stage struggled with a broken string, causing the entire ensemble to falter. The conductor raised his hands, flustered, trying to guide them back into rhythm, but the melody collapsed into a chaotic tangle of mismatched notes. The bride glanced nervously at the groom. Staff scrambled, the hall shifted into a quiet panic, and that was when Khalid finally rose from his chair, moving not with anger, but with a stillness so decisive it silenced the people nearest to him. Without a word, he crossed the hall and stepped beside the struggling musicians. The conductor opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Khalid gently reached for the spare violin on the stand. The musicians froze. Everyone knew Khalid as a businessman, not an artist, but the moment he positioned the instrument beneath his chin, everything changed. His posture transformed, his expression softened, and in a breath he drew the bow across the strings with a clarity so pure it sliced through the noise like light breaking open a storm. The hall stopped, heads turned, conversations died mid-sentence. It wasn't just skill. This was mastery that belonged to another lifetime. Then the unexpected happened. The remaining musicians instinctively followed him. The cellos fell into rhythm, the violas harmonized, and the entire orchestra reorganized around the man who wasn't supposed to know music at all. Within seconds, the wedding was filled with a soaring rendition of the original melody, richer and more emotional than the rehearsal had ever been. Even the bride wiped away a tear, stunned by the beauty emerging from chaos. And across the room, Rafiq's smile faded, not because of envy, but because he recognized in that moment what everyone else was now seeing. The man they mocked, avoided, and underestimated had just revealed a talent so breathtaking it rewrote the room's opinion of him in a single note. But brilliance, especially when revealed at the wrong moment, can threaten the wrong people. And as the last note of Khalid's impromptu performance dissolved into stunned applause, the orchestra's conductor stepped forward with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Al-Rashad," he said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, "but this wedding is not the place for interference." The word landed like a slap. Murmurs rippled through the guests. A few clapped awkwardly, not sure whether to celebrate or retreat. Khalid simply handed the violin back, his expression unreadable, but the humiliation was sharp, deliberate, and timed perfectly. The groom's uncle, who had hired the orchestra and prided himself on every detail of the event, stormed toward Khalid with the stiff posture of a man who needed someone to blame. "You disrupted the entire performance," he hissed quietly, though everyone near them could hear. "This was a wedding, not a display of ego. Please return to your seat and refrain from causing further issues." People stared, pretending not to listen while savoring every second. It didn't matter that he had saved the performance. It didn't matter that he had restored the bride's joy. The narrative had already been twisted. The billionaire had embarrassed the professionals. Then came the final blow, the one designed to shatter his dignity completely. Moments later, a member of the event staff approached him with an apologetic expression. "Sir, the family has asked that you relocate to a quieter table outside the main hall. They said it will avoid further interruptions." In other words, he was being removed, politely exiled, hidden from sight like a problem that needed to be contained. And though Khalid's face remained composed, a crack formed beneath that stoic surface. For the first time that evening, he felt the weight of something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not shock, but the old ache of being unwanted, despite having done everything right. Khalid had barely taken his first step toward the secondary hall when his phone vibrated, once, sharply, with the distinct tone reserved for only 3 people in his life. He considered ignoring it. Tonight had already carved enough wounds into his pride, but something, a whisper of instinct, made him check the screen. The name glowing back at him froze him in place. Rafik Darzi, the rival who had smirked at his humiliation, the man who hadn't spoken more than a handful of polite insults to him in the last 5 years. Now calling him in the middle of the wedding, it made no sense. Unless, of course, it made perfect sense in a way he didn't yet see. He answered with the distant calm of someone preparing for another blow. But instead of sarcasm, instead of mockery, he heard something he had never expected from Rafik: urgency. "Khalid," the man whispered, as if afraid of being overheard, "meet me outside. Now. It's important." No elaboration, no arrogance, just a clipped, tense demand that carried a weight Khalid had not heard in the man's voice since they were teenagers. For a moment, Khalid said nothing, listening closely, dissecting every breath, every hesitation. Something was wrong, badly wrong, and whatever it was, Rafik had chosen him, the man he seemed to take pleasure in undermining, to deal with it. He slipped through the decorative archway leading to the terrace, leaving behind the noise of music and the stares that had followed him all night. The air outside was cooler, quiet, almost too calm. Rafik stood at the edge of the balcony, hands clasped tightly behind his back, shoulders rigid. When he turned to face Khalid, the mask of the charismatic billionaire was gone. In its place was a man holding onto composure by a thread. That was the moment Khalid realized. Destiny wasn't calling him for revenge, validation, or spectacle. It was calling him because something was about to unravel, and he was the only person Rafik trusted enough to face it. For a long moment, Rafik didn't speak. He paced once, twice, the way a man does when every possible sentence feels dangerous. When he finally met Khalid's eyes, there was no trace of rivalry, only fear buried under pride. "Someone is trying to destroy me tonight," he said quietly, each word landing like a stone dropped into water. "Not embarrass me, not compete with me, destroy." Khalid stood perfectly still, waiting, the silence between them stretching thin. Rafik swallowed hard before continuing. "A deal I've spent 2 years building is about to collapse because someone leaked confidential documents. Documents only 3 people had access to, and one of them is here at this wedding." Khalid's eyes narrowed, not out of suspicion but calculation. Rafik wasn't a man who asked for help. He was a man who bought it, commanded it, or manipulated it. For him to call Khalid of all people meant the situation was critical. "Why come to me?" Khalid asked. It wasn't bitterness, just truth seeking truth. Rafik exhaled sharply, frustration and vulnerability tangled in his voice. "Because despite everything, you're the only person I know who can look at a mess like this and find the thread no one else sees. You watch people, you read rooms, you catch details others miss. And he hesitated, the words scraping out of him. "I need that. I need you." The confession hung in the air between them, stripping years of rivalry down to something raw and unexpectedly human. For the first time that evening, Khalid felt the balance of power shift. Not through arrogance, not through revenge, but through necessity. Rafik wasn't asking for a favor, he was asking for salvation. And the irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who took pleasure in isolating Khalid, in amplifying his loneliness, was now turning to him as the only lifeline capable of pulling him back from the edge. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor far sharper than any insult exchanged between them. Khalid didn't answer immediately. He let the silence settle, let Rafik feel the weight of what he was asking. For years, this man had chipped away at his dignity in subtle strikes, public jabs, private condescendence, calculated slights masked as jokes. And now he stood trembling at the edge of ruin, asking for the very loyalty he had never offered. Khalid turned his gaze toward the city skyline beyond the balcony, the lights shimmering like scattered promises. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and carved with new boundaries. "If I help you," he said, "there will be rules, and you will respect them." Rafiq straightened slightly, caught off guard by the sharpness beneath Khalid's composure. "Name them," he said, though not without a flicker of defensiveness. Khalid stepped closer, not aggressively but with a presence that filled the air between them. "First," he said, "you will not talk down to me again. Not in public, not in private. If I'm to fix your disaster, you will treat me as your equal." Rafiq blinked, stunned, because no one spoke to him that way. "Second," Khalid continued, "if I uncover betrayal, sabotage, or corruption in your circle, you will not interfere. You asked for the truth. You'll accept it, even if it hurts your pride." Rafiq swallowed, trying to mask the sting in his eyes. The old dynamic between them, the rivalry, the imbalance, the constant need to perform dominance, was dissolving under the pressure of the moment. Khalid's final condition landed with the quiet force of a man reclaiming every ounce of respect he had been denied. "And third," he said, "I will proceed my way. No shortcuts, no theatrics, no pressure. You want my mind, then you trust my process." For the first time in their long history, Rafiq nodded, not with arrogance, but with surrender. "Agreed," he whispered, and in that fragile exchange, a new version of their relationship began, a version born not from competition, but from necessity and hard-earned boundaries. Khalid didn't waste time. The moment Rafiq agreed to his conditions, something shifted inside him, not pride, not revenge, but clarity. He straightened his suit jacket, rolled back his shoulders, and stepped away from the balcony with the purposeful stride of a man returning to a battlefield on his own terms. The humiliation from earlier no longer clung to him. Instead, it hardened into focus. He walked back into the wedding hall, not as the isolated billionaire they had mocked, but as a strategist stepping into a live puzzle. Every table, every whisper, every movement of the staff became data points in a map only he could read. His mind sharpened, his presence changed, and the room seemed to sense it before anyone could name why. He requested access to the event's backstage areas, lighting booths, staff corridors, catering prep rooms, spaces no guest ever saw. And this time, the workers who had avoided him earlier stepped aside without hesitation. Something in his tone, something in his eyes, told them he wasn't here to demand luxury. He was here to fix something vital. He spoke with calm authority, asking precise questions, inspecting schedules, studying the security layout, reading expressions like they were lines in a book he knew by heart. His posture grew more controlled, his movements more efficient. The waitstaff, who had watched him suffer earlier, now watched him reclaim the space with a quiet power that made them straighten subconsciously as he passed. By the time he reached the service elevator, he was no longer the man who had been pushed aside, mocked, and relocated. He had stepped into a different version of himself, one he hadn't embraced in years, the version who built companies from chaos, who turned negotiations around with a single observation, who saw deceit before it spoke aloud. And as he rode the elevator down to the lower level where deliveries were checked and staff rotated shifts, he felt something unexpected stirring beneath the layers of discipline. Anticipation, not for revenge, but for the moment everything would finally make sense. Tonight he would uncover the truth, and when he did, no one, not even Rafiq, would ever underestimate him again. The grand arena wasn't a courtroom, a boardroom, or a negotiation table. It was the heart of the wedding itself, transformed by urgency into a stage of truth. As Khalid ascended the staircase from the service corridors and re-entered the main hall, the atmosphere had changed. Guests filled the dance floor, the lights dimmed into a warm gold, and music wrapped the room in a veneer of celebration. But beneath the glamour, he could feel the tension, the suspicious glances among business partners, the quiet messages exchanged behind fans and phones, the subtle shifts of people guarding information. They didn't want exposed. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a battleground disguised as a party. Rafiq stood near the head table, masking his anxiety beneath a smooth smoothed expression, but Khalid could read the stiffness in his shoulders. Important investors surrounded him, each one with the power to end the multi-million-dollar deal he had spent years building. If the rumors of leaked documents spread any further, tonight would mark the collapse of everything Rafiq had worked for. And Khalid knew their enemy was somewhere in this room, blending in with the rose-colored gowns, polished tuxedos, and polite smiles. He scanned the faces methodically, board members, consultants, family friends, even event staff, and the layout of social alliances began to take shape like a digital map overlaying the scene. Then Rafiq subtly nodded toward a reserved VIP section where the final negotiation with investors would soon take place. That was the arena, the moment where everything would either fall apart or be salvaged. In that enclosed circle of power, decisions worth millions would be made, reputations would rise or crumble, and the truth, if Khalid uncovered it in time, would determine the fate of everyone involved. As he stepped toward it, pushing through silk dresses and murmured conversations, the orchestra struck a dramatic chord that echoed across the hall, as if announcing the beginning of a duel. The time for preparation was over. The confrontation had begun. Khalid entered the VIP section with the deliberate calm of a surgeon approaching a difficult operation. The investors greeted him with polite nods, surprised to see him involved, but none questioned his presence. His reputation commanded silence, even from skeptics. As he observed the semicircle of powerful men and women, one detail struck him. Every person appeared steady, except one. At the far end of the table sat Yusuf Haldan, Rafiq's longtime financial advisor, a man praised for loyalty and discretion. But tonight Yusuf's hands fidgeted beneath the table, his eyes darting toward Rafiq every few seconds, as though calculating consequences. To anyone else, it looked like nerves. To Khalid, it looked like guilt, desperately wearing the mask of stress. He moved slowly behind the chairs, pretending to admire the floral arrangements, while actually studying every micro-expression, tightened jaws, pressed lips, sudden inhales. But no one reacted as sharply as Yusuf did each time the leaked documents were mentioned. When an investor casually referenced unexpected information circulating, Yusuf's shoulders flinched so slightly most people would miss it. Khalid didn't miss anything. He'd spent his life analyzing people who hid knives behind smiles, and this man looked like he was holding one beneath the table. But there was something else, something strange. Every time a waiter passed with a tray, Yusuf's nervousness spiked, as if he feared being overheard. That was when Khalid noticed her, the waitress, the same one who had approached him when everyone else avoided him. She moved through the VIP area gracefully, effortlessly, but with eyes sharper than anyone realized. And Yusuf tracked her every step, not with attraction, with fear, a very specific kind of fear, the kind a saboteur has when someone unexpected witnessed something they shouldn't have. Khalid's pulse tightened. The hidden enemy wasn't acting alone. Yusuf had done something he was terrified she knew about, and if Khalid wanted the truth, he needed to understand exactly what that waitress had seen. Khalid didn't confront Yusuf immediately. Instead, he followed the waitress's path with measured steps, weaving through the crowd until he found her near the service station where empty glasses were being collected. She jumped slightly when she saw him. No one expected a billionaire to approach a staff member, but her eyes carried the same quiet courage she'd shown earlier. "I need to ask you something," he said softly, leaning close enough that the surrounding music masked their conversation. "You saw something tonight, something someone hoped you wouldn't." Her breath hitched, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she nodded once, subtly, like someone finally relieved she wasn't imagining the danger she'd sensed. She led him to a side corridor near the kitchen entrance, where the noise of the wedding dimmed into a soft echo. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "When the violin string broke, I went backstage to grab the replacement set. I saw Mr. Yusuf there, but he wasn't helping the musicians. He was on his phone." She paused, swallowing hard. "He was taking pictures of confidential files, documents with your friend's company logo. He panicked when he saw me. He said he was checking financial numbers, but he wasn't. He was sending the photos to someone." Khalid felt the puzzle snap into place. Not Only had Yusuf leaked the documents. He had used the chaos of the performance failure as a cover, and more importantly, he had been caught by the one person no one would think to question, a waitress invisible to the wealthy. But the detail that sealed it, the tiny, decisive clue, was what she said next. "He dropped something," she whispered, reaching into her apron. She pulled out a glassy shard, a broken SIM card, snapped in half. "He stomped on it and ran off. I picked up the pieces." Khalid recognized it immediately. It was a disposable card used for anonymous transfers, almost impossible to trace unless someone knew what to look for. And Khalid did. In that single moment, the truth became undeniable. Yusuf wasn't just sabotaging Rafiq. He had planned an escape, a payout, and a cover story. And now, thanks to her, Khalid held the one thread capable of unraveling every lie in front of the entire VIP room. Khalid returned to the VIP section with the calm confidence of a man who already knew the ending to a play no one else realized they were in. The fragment of the SIM card rested discreetly in his palm, hidden beneath the cuff of his sleeve. He took his place beside Rafiq, who looked at him with a question burning behind his eyes, but Khalid gave no hint, no signal, nothing that would alert the predator in the room. Instead, he addressed the investors gathered around the table with a smooth, steady voice. "Before the negotiations resume," he said, "I believe there's a matter of internal security that requires immediate clarification." Yusuf stiffened, eyes widening in alarm, but he forced a smile that faltered at the edges. Khalid gestured toward the orchestra string incident earlier. "A leak often needs chaos to move unseen," he said, pacing slowly behind the chairs as if simply illustrating a point. "And sometimes the chaos is manufactured. Tonight, for example, someone used the backstage confusion to transmit sensitive documents." He paused behind Yusuf's chair. The advisor's breath hitched, sweat gathered above his brow. The investors exchanged glances, tension rising like a tide. "Now," Khalid continued, "if such a person panicked, they might destroy the tool used for the leak." In one fluid motion, he placed the broken SIM card on the table in front of Yusuf. The advisor's face drained of color. The room fell silent. Before Yusuf could form a lie, Khalid delivered the final strike, not with accusation but with opportunity. "Yusuf," he said calmly, "if you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind explaining what this is, and perhaps unlocking your phone for the investors, just to clear your name." Trapped from every angle, surrounded by powerful witnesses, and with his escape plan shattered, Yusuf's composure collapsed. His hands trembled, his mouth opened and closed without words. One investor leaned forward sharply, another narrowed her eyes, and then, realizing the walls had already caved in, Yusuf made the mistake Khalid had been waiting for. He stood up abruptly, grabbed his jacket, and tried to leave. That single act, flight, condemned him completely. The trap had sprung shut, flawlessly. The moment Yusuf bolted, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in authority. Two security personnel, stationed discreetly near the entrance, reacted instantly, intercepting him before he could take 3 steps. Investors rose from their seats, voices sharp and demanding, their earlier doubts collapsing under the weight of what they had just witnessed. Yusuf didn't fight. The last remnants of resistance drained out of him as he sagged between the guards, realizing the empire he had hoped to sabotage had now crushed him instead. Khalid didn't move, didn't speak. He only watched, calm and steady, as the truth he had unveiled reshaped the entire power dynamic in the room. Rafiq approached slowly, disbelief and gratitude tangled across his face. The investors turned to him, some apologizing for their earlier suspicions, others praising the swift resolution. One of them, a stern woman known for dismantling CEOs with a single sentence, looked directly at Khalid. "If this is the kind of insight you bring," she said, "then our deal remains not only intact, but strengthened." Another nodded. "Anyone who has Al-Rashad at their side is already 3 steps ahead of their enemies." Compliments poured in, recognition blooming where mockery had lived just hours earlier. Reputation, once a fragile thing, now solidified around Khalid like stone. And amid the shifting tides of respect, Rafiq extended his hand, a gesture heavy with meaning. Not rivalry, not dominance, but acknowledgement. "You saved everything," he said quietly, voice thick with sincerity. "Not just the deal, me." For the first time, Khalid accepted the handshake without hesitation. The victory wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, earned, and deeply human. In the span of a single night, he had transformed from an isolated figure to the pivotal force that altered the fate of an entire negotiation. And everyone in that room now understood one truth: the man they once avoided was the man they should have feared losing. When Khalid finally stepped out of the VIP section, the wedding hall looked entirely different. Not because the decor had changed, but because he had. The same guests who earlier whispered about him now watched him with widened eyes and quiet awe. Word had traveled faster than music. The billionaire they dismissed had uncovered a corporate traitor in the middle of a celebration, saving a deal worth billions. But Khalid didn't bask in the attention. He moved with a new kind of steadiness, a grounded confidence free from arrogance. For the first time all night, he didn't feel like an outsider walking through a room that didn't want him. He felt like someone who had chosen exactly where he stood. As he walked along the periphery of the dance floor, staff members straightened instinctively, not out of fear, but respect. The same waiter who had nearly avoided serving him earlier now approached with a sincere nod. "Sir, can I bring you anything?" he asked gently. Khalid smiled, a rare expression that softened the edges of his usually stoic face. "No, thank you," he replied, his tone warm enough to disarm the young man. Even the musicians, who had witnessed his earlier humiliation, lowered their instruments briefly in subtle acknowledgement. The entire hall seemed to shift around him, as if finally seeing the person beneath the wealth, the restraint, the armor. But the moment that meant the most awaited him near the back corridor. The waitress, the one who had dared approach him when no one else would, stood watching him with a mixture of relief and shy pride. She hadn't sought recognition, yet her small act of courage had set the entire night in motion. As Khalid approached, she straightened as though expecting a formal thank you. Instead, he said softly, "You changed more tonight than you know." She blinked, startled by the depth of sincerity in his voice. And as he walked past her, returning to the world that now viewed him differently, he knew something fundamental had shifted, not only in the room, but inside himself. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Later in the night, long after the drama had settled and laughter once again floated through the wedding hall, Rafiq found Khalid standing on the terrace where their confrontation and reconciliation had begun. The city lights shimmered below them, a glittering reminder of everything they had fought to build. For a moment, Rafiq didn't speak. He leaned on the railing, shoulders heavy in a way that had nothing to do with business. When he finally exhaled, his voice carried a truth stripped of pride. "Do you know why I've always pushed you away? Mocked you? Tried to overshadow you?" he asked quietly. Khalid remained still, waiting, not with judgment but with patience. Rafiq's eyes glistened, reflecting the city like tiny, fractured stars. "Because you were everything I feared I couldn't be," he admitted. "You had the discipline I lacked, the instincts, the clarity. Even as kids, you saw things none of us could. And instead of learning from you, I competed with you." He swallowed hard, the confession scraping through years of ego. "My whole life I thought power meant being the loudest in the room, the most admired. But tonight you saved me without demanding anything, without humiliating me. You did what I couldn't do myself." His voice cracked, just barely, a man finally acknowledging the truth he'd buried under decades of bravado. Khalid looked at him not with triumph, but with a rare gentleness. It wasn't forgiveness. There had been nothing to forgive, only wounds never named. "Rafiq," he said softly, "power was never the noise. It was always the quiet." Rafiq nodded, a shaky laugh escaping him, half grief, half relief. "You're right," he whispered. "I've spent years being afraid you'd replace me. But tonight, you reminded me that maybe you were the person I needed beside me all along." In that fragile moment, beneath the desert sky and the hum of celebration behind them, the rivalry dissolved, replaced by something truer, older, and long overdue: respect. Khalid let Rafiq's confession settle between them like a quiet truth finally released into the night air. He could have asked for repayment, promised alliances, or strategic favors worth millions. But as he glanced back toward the wedding hall, toward the waitstaff rushing to clear tables, toward the young waitress who had unknowingly rerouted the entire course of the night, his heart settled on something entirely different. "If you want to repay me," he said softly, "then don't do it for me. Do it for the people who never get invitations to rooms like this." Rafik frowned slightly, not understanding. Khalid continued, voice steady. "Your company needs to extend scholarship funds, training programs, real economic growth for the workers who hold our world together, starting with the staff who saved you tonight." For the first time, Rafik looked genuinely shaken, not by fear, but by the weight of what Khalid was asking. It wasn't a favor. It was a transformation, a shift in legacy, a chance to change lives he had never truly seen before. "You're asking me," he said slowly, "to give opportunity to people no one in our circles ever acknowledges." Khalid nodded. "Yes, because we were raised to believe power was a privilege, but tonight proved it must be a responsibility." The words landed with quiet force, echoing across the terrace like a pledge waiting to be signed. Rafik stared at him, chest rising with a deep breath that signaled the acceptance of something bigger than profit. Finally, Rafik extended his hand once more, this time not as an apology or gratitude or surrender, but as a vow. "Then it's done," he said, voice firm. "Every member of the staff tonight will receive a bonus, and moving forward, we'll build programs that lift people, not just impress them." Khalid clasped his hand, sealing the promise, and at the edge of the terrace, just out of sight, the waitress paused as she carried an empty tray toward the kitchen, unaware that her small act of bravery had just changed the fate of countless others. The condition was set, the vow made, and for the first time in their shared history, Khalid and Rafik were not rivals, not competitors, but partners in something that mattered far more. As the wedding drew to a close and the final guests drifted toward their cars, Khalid lingered for a moment at the edge of the emptying hall. The night that had begun with humiliation, loneliness, and the echo of a chair scraping across marble had transformed into something entirely different. He watched as workers he once moved past, unnoticed, now laughed together, their burdens a little lighter because of promises made in quiet corners of the night. The waitress walked by carrying a stack of folded tablecloths, and when their eyes met, she offered him a small, knowing smile, one that carried gratitude, respect, and something softer he wasn't ready to name. For the first time in years, Khalid didn't feel like a man standing apart from the world. He felt like someone who had stepped back into it. Outside, the city hummed with its usual restless brilliance, but tonight it seemed gentler, like the lights themselves had softened in acknowledgement of everything that had changed. Rafik stood near the valet entrance, speaking with his investors, confidence renewed, but tempered now with humility. He glanced at Khalid and lifted a hand in a silent gesture of respect, a gesture that, months earlier, would have been unthinkable. The rivalry that had shaped so much of their lives had dissolved into something far stronger, a bond forged through truth, failure, and the courage to confront what lay broken beneath the surface. The future was uncertain, but for the first time it felt like they were walking toward it, without the shadows of past wounds holding them back. As Khalid stepped into the cool desert night, a thought lingered in his mind, simple, honest, irresistible. Sometimes the smallest kindness rewrites the greatest stories. He looked back at the venue one last time, remembering how a single waitress had walked toward him when everyone else walked away. That moment had changed everything. A ruined performance saved, a sabotage exposed, a rivalry transformed, and an entire company redirected toward lifting lives instead of guarding power. And so he asked himself, and now perhaps you, one final question. How many lives could be changed if more people dared to step toward someone who seemed alone?